So I'm beginning to think that it is going to become my thing on here to completely and utterly miss the perfect opportunities to do a particular review. Take To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. I actually finished reading this book, I believe, back in January, and I thought, hey, February is Black History Month. What better time for me to do an in-depth textual analysis of a book that is very, very strongly about race relations. Well, yeah, for a number of reasons, most of them dealing with me just not getting around to it, it didn't happen. So I thought, okay, well that's alright. It's okay to miss out on that, just so long as I get my analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird out before John Green does his crash course episodes on To Kill a Mockingbird. To be fair, I did get my Books vs. Movies review of Frankenstein out before John Green did his Crash Course episodes on Frankenstein, so I'm good on that one, but yeah. So, that out of the way, Ultimate Recommendation Book Club on To Kill a Mockingbird. This is one of those books where every time I read it, I love it a little bit more, and I discover something new to love about it. The first time I read this book, as I think is the case with most people, was in high school. My junior year was American literature, and rather than assign us specific works of American literature to read, my teacher gave us a list of famous works of American literature and let us pick 2 or 3 of them to read throughout the year. Maybe because it was my own choice and it wasn't thrust upon me, I actually came away from this book really enjoying it. Not just tolerating it like you might do in a high school English class, but actually enjoying it and feeling like I would read it again. Because I was, at that time, a member of a progressive family living in a small conservative town, just like Scout was a member of a progressive family living in a small conservative town. And so it resonated to me for that reason more than anything. I don't remember exactly when I next read the book. It was probably in college at some point, but the next time I remember reading the book was when I read it in 2009 as part of my favorite book series. So no, this is not the first time that I have reviewed this book on this channel. In fact, I believe this is the 3rd time I've reviewed this book on this channel. I did it once as a favorite books review and once as a Books vs. Movies review. And when I did it as a favorite books review, what stuck out to me then was the narration and just how interesting and complex it was. And the next time I read it, of course, I was comparing it to the movie for the Books vs. Movies review, and what stuck out to me at that time was, in the telling of the story in the book, just how simply she tells it, and how unpretentiously she tells it, and how it starts out as just the story of how her brother broke his arm this one time when they were kids. And it is through telling us the series of events that led to Jem breaking his arm that we learn about all this other stuff that happened in her childhood. When you first start reading the first few chapters, a lot of times it seems like the chapters don't really have much to do with each other. Like, a lot of them deal with Boo Radley and their ongoing quest to get him to come out of his house. A lot of them deal with Scout and Jem's relationship with Dill, and a lot of them deal with describing to us this very small town, and yes, some of them do deal with the beginning of the whole not Boo Radley, the Tom Robinson thing. But there are a few chapters in there that don't really seem to have anything to do with anything. But let's start from the beginning. The first chapter is very simply to give us very basic exposition, to tell us this is the story of how Jem broke his arm. And of course it's not that at all, and we learn that a little bit farther into the chapter, that we're going to be learning about all these other things that they mentioned in passing: the Tom Robinson case, Boo Radley, Dill, all these different things that we're reading and we're like, what is this and what are they talking about? But we'll learn about them later. And in the course of this exposition, we get a little bit of a history of Scout's family and Scout's upbringing, and also the environment in which she lives. And this whole book, and this first chapter in particular, is very, very rich with that atmosphere. You really do get the sense that you're there. It's very descriptive. It has a lot of detail, but it shows you the environment that she's living in. It doesn't tell you so much, it shows you, and I really appreciate about this, and that's one of the things that I liked about it even when I first read it. We also meet Dill, who becomes kind of a major character in this whole narrative, and we are introduced to the character of Boo Radley. And this is the first kind of instance of the theme of prejudice in this book. Prejudice, of course, plays a huge role in this book with the Tom Robinson case, and when you hear people talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, they usually talk about the racism aspect. They usually talk about that aspect of the prejudice, and of course that is a very, very important theme and an important aspect of this book, and you would be foolish to ignore that. Just in general, they talk about prejudice against people who just plain don't fit in. Not because they are a different race or a different gender or whatever, but just because they don't fit in. Boo Radley and the whole Radley family are recluses. They stay behind closed doors. They don't really interact with the other people in the town, and in a small town like this, that is extremely taboo. It's explained to us in the first chapter, or at least the first few chapters, that the residents of this town typically leave their front doors open in the summer when it's warm enough so that they seem very open to neighbors coming over and chatting and socializing. It's a very, very open and very, very social environment. The Radleys do not do this. And of course, Boo, being the most reclusive of the recluses, has all these rumors flying around about him, and people kind of make assumptions about him without ever having really known him or even seen him. All they know are these stories about him, and whether any of these stories are true, we never actually find out. But that's not really the point. The point is, Boo Radley is this very mysterious figure that everyone kind of has these really, really bad feelings about. And I'm even going to go out on a limb here and say that Boo Radley and the prejudice against him is probably one of the most compelling examples of prejudice in this book, even more so than the prejudice against Tom Robinson. Because the prejudice against Tom Robinson, you kind of expect that. In the South, during this time, you expect there's going to be prejudice against African Americans. But this prejudice is the kind that people don't really talk about because there's not any one group of people that you can set aside and say, people are prejudiced against these people. It's just people who just plain don't fit in with everybody else. Now in the next couple of chapters, we see Scout going to school for the first time. We see Scout interacting with some of her classmates, and this is the point when we start to learn a little bit about various other families. This being a small conservative town, it's made up mostly of families that have been there for a very, very long time, for many, many generations sometimes. You see Scout and the other kids in the class too kind of lump particularly the Cunninghams and the Ewells into these sort of stereotypes based strictly on their family name. The Ewells are no good. They show up to school on the first day and then you never see them again. They're filthy, they're dirty, they're just terrible, terrible people. The Cunninghams are poor. They don't have a lot of means, they don't have a lot of money, but they would rather break their back for you and do all sorts of work for you than ask for a handout. In addition, we also learn a little bit about Scout's upbringing. We learn about the Finches and the sort of things that they value. The next few chapters, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, focus a little bit more on Boo Radley again. We're back to learning more about the Radleys. We're back to the relationship of Scout and Jem with this recluse who they've never seen, but they're still interacting with because Boo is leaving them gifts in the tree hole by their house. Chapter 8 is one of those chapters that doesn't really fit in with the rest of the book. It's a thing that happens in Scout's childhood. You've got the snowfall in winter, which is very unusual for this area of the South, and then you've got the fire that everyone rushes out and goes to help put out. And the thing about these events is that neither one of them is important to the overall story. You can cut this chapter out of the book completely and not really lose anything in the narrative, but it continues to establish the atmosphere of the location in which they live. The snowfall and them being so excited about the snowfall is kind of a big deal because if you don't live in that area, if you live in a place like I do where there's snowfall all the frickin' time, thank you Snowpocalypse 2014, you might not know what it's like to experience life where you don't get that much snow, and when you do get a big snowfall like that, it's a big deal. And then you've got the fire, which shows instances of all of these different people in Maycomb, all of these different people coming together to put out this fire, regardless of their background, regardless of how they feel about everybody else, regardless of the little snipping differences that they have with each other, which we've seen in the other chapters. They come together to help one of their own. They're protective of one of their own. And I mean, they're also worried about the fire spreading to the other houses. There's the selfish aspect of it too, but I like to think that they come together to help one of their own. The following chapter gives us the first mention of the Robinson case, with specifically Scout's family. We actually meet more members of Scout's family, and some of the more conservative members of Scout's family who don't necessarily like the way that Atticus raises kids, and we've seen evidence of this throughout the rest of the chapter too, that Atticus is too lenient on his kids, he lets them run wild. But here now you have members of his own family questioning his decision to defend this person and, actually defend him, not just, defend him as a courtesy because it's his job to defend him because the case was assigned to him, but actually put work and time into this case and honestly defend this man. And so we learn a little bit more about Atticus, and more importantly, Scout learns more about Atticus. And this is something that's very important. Scout, because she is a child and because she is coming to the story from the perspective of a child, does not see things in the same way that the adults reading the story do. And that's where we get this very complex perspective. We have Scout the child, and we hear her perspective, and we hear her sometimes very narrow-minded, as children tend to be, very narrow-minded, very selfish, very childish perspective on the whole thing, but at the same time, we as adults recognize what's going on. We as adults have the maturity to know what's going on, and moreover, the adult Scout who is telling the story from her perspective also understands what's going on, and so she's able to put a little bit more of a mature adult spin on what's going on and kind of mix that up a little bit so that we get both perspectives kind of layered together. That is very apparent with Scout's perception of her father, and we actually get a little bit more into that in the following chapter, chapter 10. Chapter 10 is the one with the rabid dog, and this is another one of those chapters that you could completely cut from the story and would not lose anything from the narrative. It's just like Scout, the adult Scout, is telling this story and, oh yeah, this one time this thing happened with this rabid dog. Let me tell you about that for a moment. But what does this do? It, again, shows us the growth of the child Scout in her perception of her father. Her father, she discovers, is really good with a gun, despite the fact that he doesn't like guns. And again, you could cut it completely from the story and not lose anything in the narrative except that added bit of growth and that added bit of development and complexity in these characters, which makes this story such a rich, rich story. And then, of course, you have chapter 11, the last chapter in part 1, and the last chapter that we're going to talk about in this particular video, with Mrs. DuBose. Every small town, I think, has a Mrs. DuBose, this crotchety old lady who doesn't like anybody or anything or seem to have any cares other than her own. And through a series of events, Jem is made to read to her at her bedside in what he later realizes are her last days. It takes that prejudice theme that is so prevalent and so common against the good guys in this story and turns it around. Jem and Scout are prejudiced against Mrs. DuBose. They don't see her as a real person, they just see her as this horrible, crotchety old lady. But they are made to see her as a person, as Jem is made to read to her. And it's interesting to me that it's Jem who is doing the reading, and Jem who is the real pivotal character at this point. In fact, throughout this novel, Jem really is the pivotal character. He's the adolescent. He's the one going through these big major changes. Atticus is another pivotal character as he takes on this case. Scout is the child. She's not really the pivotal character. She shows growth and development throughout the story, but it's through her observations of her brother and her father. And it's very interesting that they chose her perspective to tell this story, and you really see that interesting perspective in this particular chapter, as she is not necessarily part of the action, but she's watching Jem be part of this particular action. And so even though it's not immediately obvious, this does fit into that theme of prejudice, not just prejudice against the protagonist, but the prejudices that the protagonists have. And that's another reason why I think it's very important for a child to be narrating this, because children are, by nature, very prejudiced. They haven't learned yet how to imagine others complexly. They haven't learned yet how to see other people as people and not these sort of one-word descriptions that they might have for them. This person is mean, this person is stupid, this person is whatever. They haven't learned that complexity yet. And so we see Scout throughout this story, through various observations and through various things that happened to her and happened to the people close to her, learning to view others complexly and learning this very complicated idea of viewing other people as people. And so already in this first part of the book, you have a lot added to this theme of prejudice to set up the next part of the book when we get into the Tom Robinson case and really delve into the theme of racism that is very present in this novel as well. The next section that we're going to look at is the beginning of part 2, which is going to be chapters 12 through 21, I believe. That's the next big chunk that we're going to look at. So go ahead and take a look at that section for next time, and until then, happy reading.